you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen with you all, and hopefully if I go full screen, you're still, no, hang on, just one second. I'm presuming you can all now see that.
Perfect.
Yeah. Fantastic. So the title for this very brief presentation, and I'm going to absolutely rip through these ideas and give absolutely no pause whatsoever. I realize it's a Friday evening, but hopefully you've been at home for a while and that's okay to follow along with something, just like let it wash over you. But the idea towards another architecture, of course, is kind of reference to Corbusier's towards an architecture. And I think the first thing I should say about that is I don't intend to tell any of you what to think about architecture whatsoever. We're all kind of groping in the dark towards what we think practice is, what we think architecture is, what we think the architect, who we think they are, what we think they should do. And so to the kind of panoply, smorgasbord of existing architectures, I present just one more, yet another architecture. But I want to present it in quite absolute terms because I think that is what's going to make for the best conversation. I'm mostly interested in what you will think about this. So here we go. There are some things that I reject and there are some things that I accept in architecture. I really don't like modernism. I think it fetishizes the white Western history. I think it appropriates other cultures as pastiche. I think it's ironic, which is a cultural dead end. I think it rejects objective reality, which I've never really understood, since there's very many reasons to think that we can know things about reality and that there are objective truths about the universe. In terms of its self-referential form making, this takes so many different forms today, even a kind of reconstitution of modernism itself. And I think we should be very cynical or skeptical about that. And it's either it either becomes a purely historical form, or it becomes so loose in terms of talking about contemporary cultural practices that it becomes basically self-evident. And most of all, it's too personal. I'm not really interested in personal expression, actually. I'm much more interested in pluralism, which, like postmodernism, is also anti-ideological. It doesn't privilege one, let's say, different statuses of being, which we can talk about more maybe later. It doesn't privilege particular voices. It encourages parallel logics, which suggests that there is always multiple ways to accept different ways of working. It admits its own faults, it's inclusive, and it's social. It's not personal. I really don't like functions. These are just mathematical relations. They have no place in architecture whatsoever. Functions are prescriptive, they're authoritarian, they increase inequality, and they exclude those who are not able to integrate themselves with the functions. I am interested in affordances. Affordances are basically possibilities within the environment, things which are potentialities and capacities that the environment affords. So they make possible, they reveal potential, they allow for adaptation and appropriation, they're non-judgmental, and affordances are universal. And I think the pursuit of the universal is, let's say, one of the aspects of modernism which I think should be carried forward. If only you could somehow combine intersectional feminism with the universality of modernism, I think you'd be in a good position. I'm very opposed to style. I don't like this at all. It's just a way of dressing up power, and it often leaves that power uncriticized. It's extremely particular. It's not generic, and it uses style is always metaphorical, and I don't think there should be metaphors in architecture. I don't think space should be metaphorical. Style dates, which of course puts it within the process of contemporary capitalism, which constantly requires you to create something new. And I don't really know if newness in itself is something that we should be pursuing. Mood, by contrast, is something that I am interested in. Mood is much more complicated than style. And I'm kind of referring to the world of fashion really as the point of reference on mood. It's about evoking attitudes, memories, evoking sentiments. It's a kind of an emotional design. And mood is both timely, it's about creating something which is very specific to a particular moment, and also timeless. It's about almost the essential human conditions of how we experience and feel things. Of course, Real Foundation, Ellis mentioned briefly what it is. It's a normal limited company, but it has a foundation governance structure, which means that we can only take on projects that pursue inclusivity, democracy, and equalities of many kinds, amongst them, but not limited to, gender, race, wealth, class, and space. And what are our projects? Well, of course, the first project of every architect, I would argue, is the architect themselves, who they think the architect should be as a social figure. We, of course, are trying to redesign the structure of the firm, which, we bandy around these terms like office and bureau and atelier, workshop. I can't remember if I said studio, but that's on there too. But we don't necessarily think about what they really mean in terms of their precise activities and business structures. And in essence, the structure of contemporary firms has probably not significantly changed since the early 1950s. And I think we should question that. We're redesigning the client. We do have clients of a kind. They're much more like partners, and that hierarchical relationship that often occurs between a client and the architect is not present in our work. Most of our projects we self-initiate, and in that sense, that's why we're redesigning the project. We're only really interested in the normal. We're interested in what constitutes normality, why people think things are normal, where the normal was invented, why, and how we can intervene in the everyday. And for that, I would say we're mainly interested in the home. We do a variety of different activities, and currently our team is based in a really wide number of places. We don't actually have offices there. This is just a product of the pandemic. But of course, we make objects. I am a registered architect. We are designing architecture and finally beginning to get it built, which is fantastic. We also design furniture, exhibitions, all manner of physical objects. We, of course, run Real Review magazine, which is dedicated to what it means to live today, trying to understand the contemporary. We have Real Press, which produces books, Real Agency, which does consultancy work. We think it's important to engage with those in positions of power in order to change their attitudes as best we can. But this is, I would say, one of our more problematic fields of work. And then we have most recently Real Homes. For the last 5 years or so, I've been working on models of low-cost housing. And I'm pleased to say that we have a new business partner. There's a new CEO of Real, and we are very close to starting work on our first low-cost housing scheme. But the actual premise of this was to talk about these four concepts: power, space-time, economy, and affordance. These are the four principles I want to put forward. The first thing every architect should think about at the beginning of a project is power. Who does your object bring into a power relationship? How can you shape it? Who is instrumentalizing your agency? Who are you the tool of? And where does the object that you intend to create draw its own power? What relations does the object establish with other people? Does it have any autonomous agency? And what spaces would manifest this power? Why is this power relationship good? And how can you direct the agency of this object, etc.? Ultimately, I would say, power is language. So I always begin every project with etymology and history of the words that I'm being asked to consider. And then I compare the material examples that relate to those words to see what it is that people might understand by that and what space there is for reimagining or reinterpreting that. Space-time is, form is basically how power is manifest in space and time. And it's an expression of energy. That's true whether you're thinking about geological compressions that produce stone. I mean, that stone is just an expression of that form is just an expression of power. It's also true, of course, in architecture, as we know. Power takes form in space through the room. And I think the room is a fairly, for me at least, an abstract and kind of atemporal concept, which mostly takes place in the plan and is used as a kind of vectorial and tectonic series of lines which delineate power relations. It takes place in time through the mood. And this mood is extremely kind of fragile and contingent. It's not about style or aesthetic. And it would suggest in a way if successful design is rooms and moods, then what we're trying to imagine is an architecture in which the proportional system which dictates the size of the space is just as important as the softness of the sheets, the smell of the coffee, the morning light coming into the bedroom, the birds' song in the trees. All of these kind of ideas ultimately can lead to quite flabby initial proposals, and that's why economy is so central to design. Once you have your form, which has been a kind of spatial and temporal analysis and proposition for a power relationship, we need to strip out all of the waste, all of the fat from it. And in that sense, I'm interested in intelligence, not force, extreme material poverty. I'm not interested in ornament or identity. I'm not interested in ego or style. I'm not interested in unique design. I'm only interested in systems design, in this question of normality. And if anything, I would like the architect to design almost nothing. And not nothing, but almost nothing. And how then can we do more with less? And this economy I'm really talking about is not just material and physical. It relates to all manner of aspects of architecture. So as I'm trying to race through all of these slides today, I'm trying to use the economy of your attention in a very precise way, just as well as, these other ones that you can see on the list there. And the fourth is affordance. Of course, I said I don't like functionalism. I don't think we should prejudice the future use of buildings by designing them in functional ways. Design should never be finished. We as architects often like to finish buildings, but that's not how they should be, because it prevents appropriation. And in that sense, nonetheless, we should be specific about the relationships that we create, and we should create spaces which are infinitely adaptable in some ways. I'm also very interested in active objects which embody an agency immediately upon their completion, rather than ones that simply decay. And in that sense, if you imagine that every time you make something, you destroy potential of those materials. Every time you cut a material out of the earth or move it from one place to another, you destroy the potential that it had in place. In a way, affordance restores that potentiality by making it open to reinterpretation and adaptation through time. What is it that I have in mind? What am I talking about? Well, I'll run through a number of examples which are not exhaustive in any way and is a kind of different way of framing some of the work that we've done. Of course, we think about power in very simple terms, like a design game. This was designed recently. It's a set of cards to help a collective of people who are designing a commune together understand different architectural concepts, embody them, and begin to recombine them in different ways in order to take an active part in the design process itself. Of course, we think of power as a kind of media object. We're interested in promoting our ideologies or our viewpoints, our principles through media, and therefore we have real review. That's also why we print so many books, because we see these as being artifacts which are launched not just into our current time, but into the future as well, as a way of communicating ideas which we think are important to others. Of course, we also design static objects, and we're interested in the power relations that they generate between the people who interact with them, whether that's an exhibition like the British Pavilion, or a mean home, which was at the British School at Rome last year, or whether we're talking about beginning to get into more complex realms of architecture. I mean, this is again quite a simple example of power as a form of domestic estrangement. This is just a transparent wardrobe. But of course, it's a domestic object. It's not designed for commercial or other environment. And the idea is that by simply reframing our relationship with the objects that are around us, it forces us into perhaps a more thoughtful desire to consume less. We're also interested in power as capital. And this is one of the more unusual exhibitions that we're doing at the end of this year in Vienna. It's a space which is designed as a kind of analysis of Adolf Loos's salon relationships between individuals. But when you go there, you will also get this coin, which you can see the work in progress design for. This nickel coin says on the back of it that it's worth 1,000 euros, but you cannot, it will be gifted to you and you cannot sell it. You can only trade or gift it. And I'll be very interested to see, since we're making effectively €1 million worth of value, or allegedly, that's why the exhibition is called Face Value. I'll be interested to see what the consequence of these objects in the world is and what types of power relations they create. To move maybe more directly into the world of architecture, I'm also very conscious that the image and the idea ultimately have the same agency as an object. And when you start to make things which are not real, but which exist perhaps as postcards, then even that begins to have a kind of role in the world. And we as architects should be sensitive to even the significance that our images or plans produce. And this is a good example. We designed a few years ago a co-villa, which is basically like a collective housing project for the countryside in New Zealand. We were not able to build it. The group that we were working with wasn't able to raise the finance, but it ended up basically being copied and kind of produced as a pastiche by someone else. And that in itself is a kind of interesting idea, that what we've established is perhaps a model which ultimately we will not even be responsible for executing. In architecture itself, I would say that power, space-time, economy, and affordances are ultimately inseparable. You're not able to divide them. So that is what makes the last part of this presentation so difficult to do, because I can't show you at what point the economy has been introduced to the architecture. It becomes wrapped up in the entire thing. This, for example, is a set of 8 projects, which we've done one each year, slowly moving towards the low-cost housing model, which I mentioned we're now launching. These images basically deal with questions of mood. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. I would simply say as an aside that we do believe very strongly that in terms of what the architect can do to promote social justice and social equality, there are not a huge amount of things that we can do beyond what I've already suggested. However, I would argue that the reason why we have such strong focus on domestic space is because so much of the inequalities in our society, particularly to do with race and gender, and class, are embedded directly within the design of our homes. And that I would argue that a more equal home leads to a more equal family and therefore society. And I'm not going to get into that right now. I would love to talk through this plan, but I'm not going to speak to it directly. I would love to talk to this plan a little bit more, although perhaps I will say this was a design for, it's called Mean Home. It is an average Italian home based on all of the statistics that we could find about Italian homes. However, you'll notice that the plan itself, it tries to use an intense sense of economy in terms of the amount of space which is used as circulation is extremely minimal. The relationships of the rooms are extremely adaptable. They could be used for many different purposes, and they're really only defined by their solar orientations. The reason I included this one actually is because this is the only instance I could think of in which I've ever kind of explored what ornament might mean within this kind of regime that I've explained. And actually these 3 columns that you can just about see in the plan and hopefully see in the image, they're of course non-structural columns. They're designed purely in order to drive your eye through the center of the house and out towards the garden behind. I think that's the closest I've ever got to what I would think of as ornament. Most of all, this kind of paradigm or this set of principles that I've described, they lead you to a certain number of conclusions. One is that we have to learn to embrace instability. And I think the drive towards economy has a deeper, it's not just the kind of fetishism with asceticism. It has a more relevance to our contemporary situation than that. And we also have to learn to live in the absence of agency, which certainly for Real Foundation has been a constant struggle, which is that we cannot simply make everything we want to. We have to be limited by reality, and the agency of the architect is very low. And part of our project is very much to see how we can enhance that. We are actually working on 3 built works at the moment, and this is the first one that I can say can be made public, which is a house in I wonder if I have one more image. Yes, I do. Which is a house in Mexico. The reason that I mention it is in order to kind of bring all of these examples together and spend perhaps just 1 or 2 more minutes on this. The house itself is entirely financed by Real. We managed to strike a deal with the owners of the land on the west coast of Mexico. We managed to raise the finance in order to construct it ourselves. its purpose will be to house a real foundation office, which is opening in Mexico, but not only, it also has to be a place in which people can live. So it's in a sense a house for an unknown number of people, which could satisfy between 1 and 8, and for an unknown period of time, working in an unknown way. And in that sense, you'll see in the plan this drive towards what we would call a kind of plan economy. And I'm very indebted to our colleagues from London, Hesselbrand, with whom we've developed this idea of plan economy over a number of years. And non-functionalism, really thinking about affordance. I would also argue that there's a kind of economy in the materials. Even those huge monoliths actually have extremely low embodied energy. And the way that they communicate around the sense of mood, I mean, there's no point at which I would describe this as necessarily stylistic pastiche or even stylistically referential. It attempts to move beyond that question of style. Nonetheless, it tries in its form to pursue a certain idea of mood and to play on the assumptions that we all have about what it means to be in a tropical and beach environment, amongst many other things. I hope I've argued that the object is a product of a method and that the object is never an end in itself. If you take these 4 principles and you apply them to any project you're working on, it always generates something different, even though ultimately it's a unified way of thinking about architecture. Now I would like to hear what, if any, thoughts you have about what it is I have just said. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Jack. That was pretty sensational. Maybe if I kick off, but people, there's a chat box that's open, so if you've got questions, kind of pitch them in, and I'll give you the mic. Can I just ask a really super kind of straightforward question, just to begin, Jack, which is about who is we in this picture? And, you know, we were sort of moving between, you know, a very emphatic statement of your, you know, position. Is that something that's been collectively agreed, or what's the contribution of others in this story?
There are currently 7 people in the Real Foundation, including myself. They include an editing manager, a designer, a design assistant, a graphic designer, a design assistant, a studio manager, a CEO, and a personal assistant. There are no other architectural designers in the studio at the moment because I don't believe in unpaid internships and I can't afford to pay anyone to work with me or for me. Hopefully that will change in the future. So in that sense, I would say that I don't want to say ideological, more of the kind of, let's say, principles of how one might think about a firm and its operation and what architects do are very much part of a collective discussion within the studio. When it comes to the actual design of buildings themselves, sadly for the minute, it's just me. But I hope that will change in the future.
And could you say a little bit, I don't think you touched really on your teaching activities, but how does the work of the practice and the teaching can intersect?
Teaching is super important for 2 main reasons. I teach at the Architectural Association, which is pretty much the only school of architecture that would employ someone with such an unusual career as my own, I think. I did try other schools and I was rejected. But I find it very interesting. I teach there with a guy called Guillermo Lopez, who's an incredibly talented architect from Barcelona. And his firm is called Mies. And we teach exclusively about domestic design. Teaching has been really incredibly valuable for me. Partly, you know, I learn so much from my students. They're all such intelligent people and bring such incredible ideas. It also has been very helpful because a lot of the time you don't really know what you believe until you have to explain it to someone else. And teaching gives you a regular opportunity to force yourself to make yourself clear. So that's been useful. And the other is that although the money is very bad, it's actually enough that has allowed me to not have to do constant hustling for freelance work and actually concentrate on building my firm, which I know is a very time-honored method, but nonetheless is something which I think should be mentioned, that it's extremely difficult if you want to start your own practice today to have the type of financial security that allows you to grow it. If I can make it maybe another proposition, I think one of the reasons why American architecture has become so bad in the last couple of decades is really because of the cost of university fees, which means that when you graduate, you cannot be, it's very, very hard to be, unless you're independently wealthy or have some other type of financial support, to be a young architect practicing in America. The fees are kind of crippling. And so you end up giving the most radical decade of your career in your, maybe your 20s and 30s to a very large practice who's getting you to do toilet and car park diagrams. Anyway, that's another kind of, that's maybe a side point.
I was intrigued by you were working on the Lohse project in Vienna, and I'm kind of mindful that there's 150th anniversary of Lohse's birth, I think, coming up in December, which I guess is maybe the hook for what you're doing. But I mean, it felt that the arguments you were making, one could situate you within a lineage of European architectural thinking that would maybe extend from Lohse through Tessino, Grassi. Are you a European rationalist in, kind of different, using different language, or how much do you identify with that tradition?
I guess I've given up on the concept of lineages. I used to really like Mies van der Rohe. I did a lot of research into him. And as I started to discover more about his biography and found out what an absolute shit he was, it started to open a lot of Pandora's boxes for me. And now I find it very hard to really hero worship almost any, I mean, Lohse, there's some dark undercurrents to Lohse's private life. So in terms of, let's say, venerating architects, I don't know who I would identify with. I do like rationalism. That's cool. I like Grassi. He's a cool guy, sure. But at the same time, I think, I think there's a lot of humanity and sense for a kind of, basically I like rules, but I only like rules insofar as they give you a basis for them to then be broken. And so I kind of insist on an inconsistency in that sense.
I mean, I guess I point to sort of Lohse or Grassi more readily than Mies as a point of connection to your work, in that in those architects, there's a very explicit focus on economy, not just the visual economy, but the economy of labour and the economy of means. In a way, I don't think one could plausibly say that was.
No. I mean, Mies was interested in just very, very expensive buildings and bankrupting his clients and sleeping with their wives or daughters. I mean, this was his main kind of modus operandi, and we should not think highly. And he treated Lily Reich. I mean, it's good that female architects like Charlotte Perriand and Eileen Gray have kind of been restored in the public awareness in recent years. Lily Reich, I think, still remains very undervalued in terms of her role. But no, I think with all of these, I would say that I wrote a piece for Architectural Review a few years ago, which was a reputations of Rem Koolhaas, and Rem didn't like it, unfortunately. And I wouldn't say we've kind of fallen out since then, which is a shame because I admire him very much. But what I was basically arguing is that all the really great architects of the last, since the invention of architecture between 200 and 400 years ago, which I would argue is with the invention of the architect. I don't think you can have architecture really before that in any meaningful sense. But all of these architects have they've done basically a couple of things. Their recipe for success is quite straightforward. First, you make a method. You don't make a style. Frank Gehry and Zaha Hadid, they're going nowhere. They're like Anthony Gaudi. No one will ever think of them in 100 years' time because it's too particular. The ones which are really successful are those who can be emulated and imitated and who have a method which can be applied and can help other architects. So that's the first thing they do. The second thing they do is they promote it through manifestos and by taking control of the press. And Vasari, in his Lives of Great Artists, makes this quite explicit in terms of the importance of taking control of manifestos and publications. And then they do a villa, which is like because ultimately, and Rem said this to me once, the general public only understand architects through the lens of the private home. So you can do all these things like exhibitions and books and whatever you want, magazines and so on, but unless you can point to a house, then they will not accept you as an architect. So that's quite a key stage. And then, of course, they go through a process of myth making. And while I'm interested in the methodology and the press, I'm not interested in the myth making, and I don't believe in the villa really anymore. I don't think that's a way that we should think about architecture, or because it becomes too much an expression of an individual. And that's, of course, the problem with Mies, which is that he becomes so rigid in his construction of elements and systems for their assembly that there can be no mistake, there can be no breaking from that world, and it becomes horrific. I mean, the worst example of this I can think of is when I had dinner in the town hall designed by Alvar Aalto in central Finland. And, you know, I was in a town plan by him, in a town hall by him, with plates and cutlery by him, and a chair by him, with the tapestry by him and his wife. And it was just like too much, you know, like that's horrific.
What role is there for the vernacular as an idea in this conversation? I mean, certainly for an architect like Loos or Tessenow, they're in the rhetoric, at least, at the very least, the vernacular becomes a touchstone that allows them to move beyond style. Is it still a full concept that you think you could draw on as an architect today? Absolutely,
and I think it relates to this question of mood, because you want to avoid copying the style of a vernacular. I'm not really interested in how things look necessarily, but I'm interested in why they were done that way, because, you know, the vernacular is very much about this kind of drive towards economy, in the sense that in nature there is no such concept as waste. So humans who've been making buildings in a place for a very long period of time, anything that's redundant or wasteful gets stripped out, which means that everything in the vernacular is effectively essential. And that includes questions of what you might think of as style in terms of kind of aesthetic representation. But I mean, that last project I showed you, the house in Mexico, there are many reasons why it sits up on those stone obelisks or menhirs. But one of them is drawing on the history of the Stadel granary, which exists in Europe, which uses stones to raise the grain above the ground. And when you really look into the vernacular in that sense, and you look at why things have been done in such a particular way, often I'm very interested in taking typologies which are not literally or directly related to the question at hand, but understanding their principles and methods and seeing if they can be adapted in some way.
We've got a question in from Samantha. Samantha, I'm going to unmute you.
Hello. Thank you for the amazing presentation. So I have a quick question about the mood and decoration, because you've mentioned decoration shouldn't be the primary pursuit of making of a house or an architecture, but I was just wondering, because a house that is decorated in a certain way can definitely evoke a very different feeling than houses that are not decorated. So I wonder, what are you just looking through the lens of mood towards your approach to decoration, or I just wonder, like, how do you think about that, like, relation between mood and decoration? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. In terms of the construction of mood, in terms of just directly speaking about the images that I showed you, part of a problem of being a young architect, which, even though I'm 33, weirdly in our profession seems to constitute still being young, although it would not in almost any other sphere of activity, you have to try and convince people that what you're proposing can be real. So what I've been doing for the last couple of years is looking at conventions of architectural photography in terms of framing, depth of field, composition. I mean, there's a number of magazines which have been very helpful in this, and then learning in a way to replicate that through the images that I make in order to play on the assumptions. If people think that what you're proposing can be real, already you've won half of the battle, I think. So the way that I decorate an interior is always trying to evoke that question of mood. But the broader question is whether or not an architect should decorate someone else's interior. And for that, I have a lot of kind of questions and problems with it. In the sense that I would like it to be the case that if you are a Sudanese family of 5, or you are a Berlin artist couple, or you are an intergenerational Italian family, you will be able to approach the architecture that I design and decorate it for yourself in a manner that makes you feel at home. It's really a question of to what extent the architect imposes aesthetic, style, and mood upon the people who occupy their spaces. And that's why, for me, I was saying I'm really interested in removing as much as possible all questions of aesthetic or taste or style, in order to allow for a space which is quite precise in its form, but can be appropriated easily by the people who might live in there and their different needs.
Jack, this idea of that you're stripping the architecture of any cultural meaning. I mean, I guess the description you've just made, I guess, maybe again suggests Lohse in terms of that very hard division between the exterior of a building, which can't be kind of, but the interior, it can't really be, the interior is quite a separate proposition from the exterior of a building. I can think of this impulse to give space to the cultural expression of inhabitants. Is that something that also can register on the exterior of your architecture, or is that purely an internal operation? When I'm thinking of, I guess you think somewhere like Mies Brand's Alexandra Road is a place where the occupation of the building is very foregrounded in its image. But yeah, how do you negotiate that edge between what the Sudanese family might contribute and where your architecture ends?
I definitely agree with you about Lohse's concept of the interior, in terms of, I mean, he has a text which I think is called something like The Poor Rich Man, in which he describes a kind of Art Nouveau or maybe secessionist interior, in which every single object has been designed and composed, much like the Alva Alto interior I described. And of course, the man who lives there gets given some slippers by his wife for Christmas, and there's nowhere for him to put them because the space for them hasn't been designed, and they sit at odds. And he says, you know, his father, when he retired from running a factory, was given a sculpture by the workers to thank him for being such a good boss for such a long period of time. And he has to admit it was a very ugly sculpture, but nonetheless, it was embodied with a huge amount of emotional importance to his father, and therefore it sat a pride of place on the mantelpiece. And he's like, you must create an interior in which, you know, I don't want to like dumb it down to the level of a kind of like very, you know, studying interior decoration for 2 weeks and say it's about having mismatched chairs. It is really about allowing people to build up interiors over a long period of time in a very personal way. I think where Lohse and I would maybe differ is that even Lohse, in his use of very noble materials, is only really interested in the bourgeoisie and the upper classes. I'm not just interested in that. I'm interested in all classes of society without judgment. In terms of the exterior, again, you know, I don't want to design buildings that look like they were designed by an architect. And I realize that one sitting up on pillars kind of goes against that. And indeed, some of the other work I presented does too. But I'm trying more and more to move towards architecture which is sufficiently anonymous in its form. I mean, even Giorgio Grassi, you know that you're looking at something designed by an architect. It's very prominent in its form and its external form. And I'm looking for ways to break that and perhaps to allow the same type of adaptation and appropriation in the urban context as there is in the interior, which frankly is how architecture actually is really used by people anyway. So you can either resist that and you end up with something like Corbusier's project at Pessac, where it was a perfect row of modernist houses, which then got pitched roofs and little gables stuck on the outside of them over time by the residents. Or you can embrace that and say, well, we're going to leave it open-ended and they're going to find a way to adapt it over time to their needs anyway.
We've got one from Harish. Harish, I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about your commitment to multimedia and especially to print. And I suppose what values you see in kind of continuing to share your ideas through quote unquote old media versus like online sources.
There are a couple of reasons why I'm really committed to print. But before I get to that, I would very quickly say that the concept why I try to work across so many different media. I'm constantly trying to educate myself in things which I think will help me to advance the goals that I put forward and which are essential to real. And, you know, one argument for that would be an argument of hearts and minds. I mean, it's wonderful when you make architecture because you don't need to be there to explain it to anyone. It just simply is. It's a fact that it's there and people will use it. That's not the case before you built the architecture. You have to convince them that this particular approach and that these goals are worthwhile and important. And so media for me is very, very key in promoting those types of messages and ideas I mentioned about social justice, social equality. In terms of print, that ties into it quite closely. The first thing, just at a very basic level, is that print is finite. There's only a certain number of pages, and therefore it's a finished thing. It's not like a blog or a website. Websites these days are often constantly, you know, you think of Dezeen or Arc Daily, there's just like a hose pipe of new articles all the time. There's no sense actually of what it is as an object at all. And therefore there's no real sense of any editorial agenda. The other thing is that if you think about the way that your apps update on your phone, I very much doubt that you could pinpoint the moment at which Instagram changed from one style to another. It just gets lost in this constant stream. Whereas a print object is of its time. It's a clear proposal, it's fixed, it's finite. You take it, it stands for the moment at which it was produced, and it cannot be changed afterwards. But then, of course, the other thing is that you have to think about what the social connotations of this quote-unquote old media are. People still think that print, if something is printed, because of the cost and the difficulty of making that, it's still valued, I think, in our society more than something which is digital. And so if you want to give authority to the voices that you put inside your publication, even something which is done on a Xerox actually has more, weirdly, a photograph of a publication which has been made on a Xerox, posted on Instagram, has more authority than the same content simply put on Instagram. It's like the photo of the object itself increases its authority. So I'm quite interested in how we can, in effect, magnify the authority and the significance of the voices which are in a publication like Real Review.
Has Real Review got a, like San Rocco, has it got a finite period that it's going to operate across, or have you think of it as something that's going to roll?
I mean, when there's justice, there will be peace. Otherwise, it will keep going as long as the market allows for it.
And just before we began, Jack, you were talking about, I think you're 4 years into this project, into Real, and you were saying that you weren't actually working with a kind of master plan as such. It was very much from project to project, which maybe it runs a little contrary to the very emphatic statement of intent that you gave at the beginning, but it's interesting that those two things can coexist.
On the contrary, there is a 10-year plan which I wrote in 2011, and I'm in the final year of that 10-year plan, and so far I've hit all the major milestones except for one, which is the foundation of my own housing company. But I should also couch this by saying, on the one hand, I accidentally went on holiday for 3 weeks once in 2015, and I was having such a good time on the beach. I almost thought maybe I will not come back. Maybe I will just stay here on the beach and fuck everyone, basically. Like, I don't know why I'm working so hard to promote these things and work in this way. Like, I should just check out, right? So in that sense, I have a 10-year plan, which was 2 5-year plans bolted together. I'm satisfied that if I meet this final criteria, I will have done something which 10 years ago, I was living in social housing in Battersea, and I was earning £450 a month, and I often could not afford to take the bus. I frequently ran out of gas and had cold showers. 10 years ago, it would not have seemed possible to me to be in a position where I might actually complete this 10-year plan. So it seemed kind of like a fantasy. And yet I was committed to it, and I've tried to execute it. So on the one hand, I feel very proud that it seems possible to have an idea and then execute it in reality over a long period of time. On the other hand, I should say that, the sun is expanding. 300 million years, it's going to evaporate all the seas off the earth, and humanity and everything we've ever known will be destroyed. And that's not like an abstract fantasy, that's actually going to happen. And therefore, class struggle, questions of social progress or not, these all ultimately are futile. It's much more about what you choose to do with your life and how you choose to live it on a daily basis than it is about, let's say, the execution or realization of any plan. So these two things sit for me as parallel truths, which are entirely contradictory, but I accept both of them at the same time.
And looking back from this almost 10-year perspective, do you feel that your fundamental values have changed, or do you recognize the 23-year-old you as the same person?
We have similarities. I think 23-year-old me was far more dogmatic and absolutist, believed much more in some sort of objective reality. And the passion and energy has not dissolved. But the thing which has really dissolved is that I think back then I was very committed to an idea of what I would call Jack Self as a project, which was I had no money, no access to money, and no one would let me do anything I wanted. So I had to work as best I could to try and create myself as a figure in order to try and execute things in the world. Now, I don't believe in that at all. And I'm no longer interested in the question of the ego or the individual. I don't really have the same attitude towards them at all. I think I've mellowed a lot on that point. I no longer feel absolutist. I don't feel the need to convince people of anything anymore. I hope that if I lay out a convincing argument, they might be drawn towards it, but I don't get angry if someone disagrees with me. So yeah, I'd say that's the biggest change. And then, of course, maybe if I could just conclude on that, the next 10 years, I hope to disappear entirely from real foundation, in the sense that at the moment, it is really driven by me, and so far has been, of course, with many, many collaborators and many people who've been super instrumental to its development. But in essence, if I stopped working, doing freelance work, then I would no longer be able to pay any of the bills, and then the whole thing would just collapse. What my real hope is that by the second 10-year plan, if I get hit by a car or choose to spend the next 10 years on a beach, the mechanism will continue to operate independently of me, and no one will even see me. I mean, one of the biggest mistakes with OMA, I think, was the moment at which you start to see each individual partner's name appear in the copyright after a slash. It says copyright OMA / Rem Koolhaas. As soon as you do that, you've fucked it. It becomes impossible for OMA to have a life after Rem. Not that I'm in any way drawing a comparison between myself and him. It's more the fact that this idea of the architect as an ego and as an individual is something we should abandon. It's not a relevant practice for today, I think.
Now that feels, I mean, yeah, calling yourself real foundation at the very start, I guess there's implicit in that an impulse to reject the individual genius, whereas I mean, I felt sort of, it's been curious in the past year, as we've been having a lot of discussions around identity politics in relation to architecture, that a lot of those conversations seem to have reconfirmed the idea of the individual genius architect. But we're now looking for, people who aren't white men who are individual geniuses. But I do think it's a kind of fundamentally political act to call your practice something other than the name of one person.
Yeah, I mean, names in architecture firms seem to go in and out of fashion in different ways. You tend to get a generation who call them things like Archigram, and then you get a generation who call them things like Norman Foster and Associates. And, sometimes then they'll go back for a while to like KGDVS, MVRDV, these types of things. And so in a way, I don't know, it could be a question of fashion, but at least for me, I was not interested in founding a practice which was about me or which was a description of me. I was interested in founding a practice which described what it does. And in that sense, the real foundation is very much that. I'm attempting to create material objects which can serve as examples to others of the type of society that I believe we should live in. It is a very literal, real foundation. Now, it's also not up to me ultimately to decide if that's a success or not, which takes a huge amount of pressure off me, I have to say. I can be probably taken apart and criticized by those in this space or those in future generations, and that's a part of the pleasure, I guess, of being able to work.
Have there been opportunities that have come your way which you've felt over the course of this period where you felt that though it was difficult to reconcile the opportunity with the values that you were endeavoring to pursue?
Yeah, I mean, I've turned down projects, and I've also, I want to build, but I don't want to build at any cost. I would prefer to do nothing than to do something which is not in accordance with the values that I've put forward. And that's like very painful, especially when you're struggling to pay rent. That takes a really actually absolutist position, and that's been the greatest moments of difficulty when someone says, would you design a luxury flat for us? And it's like, I don't think we can do that unless we transform it into a completely different type of project. And there's very few people who would accept that. But the advantage of having been gone for 4 years is that eventually, those types of clients don't come to us anymore, because there's no longer any confusion about really what it is that we stand for and what we do, which means that the projects that we're doing, one I mentioned is this house in Mexico, which is entirely initiated by Real, and it's been a kind of colossal activity for us to get off the ground. The other one is a very interesting house. It's almost 100% recycled in New Zealand, and it's for 2 unrelated intergenerational couples without children who want to share a home together, and creates a very unusual relationship both with economy and with collective domestic space, and let's say alternative models of the family. And then the third one is an even more unusual and amazing project, which is that a group of Black intellectuals, artists, and activists have bought an acre of land in West London and are in the process of turning it into, I guess I would describe it as like Black Lives Matter meets the monastery meets Warhol's factory. And it's one of the most kind of beautiful poetic projects I've ever seen. And we've been asked to work as the master planners on that. And this, of course, initially provoked a lot of questions for me as to why they would choose Real or why they would be interested in us. And it became clear quite quickly that what they were actually asking us to do was not to, we were quite hesitant to design that architecture, especially to impose upon such a group which had already such a strong idea amongst itself. But actually what they were asking us to do is to help them design the design process. And that's actually what we've ended up doing. Those playing cards I showed are for that project, where we presented a series of definitions and concepts for non-designers to familiarize themselves with. It's basically an architectural education in 54 cards. And then they're able to layer them up. They're all categorized by power, time, and space. They're able to layer them up in different combinations in order to describe quite precisely the brief and the types of spaces and the arrangement and their relationship to each other. And so that I think will be a kind of hugely satisfying project, which is very much the kind of product of I guess what we've been trying to push for the last couple of years.